Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video we're going to be doing a build and review of AZ Model's BF109 G-14AS Reich Defense Kit. So I've previously done an inbox review of this kit and the F model that AZ Models do, so go check that one out if you're interested. But otherwise, let's get into having a build of this one. To start with, I gave all of the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil and residue from the moulding process, and after the parts were dry, I then began to cut out the front bulkhead, the cannon cover, cockpit floor, control stick, rudder pedals, seat, trim and flap control wheels, and the two fuselage halves. Some of the parts required some sanding to remove the seam lines and sprue attachment points, and after all the parts had been cleaned up, I then glued the seat and rudder pedals and control stick to the floor, along with the two control wheels to the left fuselage, and finally the instrument panel and the cannon cover to the front cockpit bulkhead. Initially, I painted the interior Vallejo 70995 German grey, which was applied with a fine brush and mixed with a bit of water to thin it down. I applied 2 coats of the Vallejo German Grey and then dry brushed some Tamiya XF63 German Grey over the top of the cockpit to add a little bit of highlighting. The AZ Model 109 cockpit has a large amount of raised details, which I painted various colours. Vallejo Flat Yellow was used to paint the fuel lines and controls, Vallejo Sky Blue was used for the oxygen control system and wiring, and Vallejo Vermilion Red was used for some of the engine controls, the flaps, and the trim wheels, and some details on the instrument panel. Unfortunately, this kit has no decals for the instrument panel, so I had to paint the raised and sunken details by hand for it. I used Vallejo Flat Earth for the base of some of the instrument dials, as well as for the base of the control column, and then I used Flat Black to pick out the various controls and instrument dials. XF16 flat aluminium was dry brushed to create some metal scratches on the control column, the seat and some of the sidewall areas, and then I used Vallejo flat white to add some white marks onto the trim wheels and to add some white details onto the instruments. I then reduced the metal chipping and neatened up some mistakes with the German grey before painting the strap around the cannon cover with flat earth and used some vermilion red and flat yellow to paint some additional details on the cockpit floor. To create the look of glass over the dials, I dabbed a little bit of Vallejo gloss varnish onto them using a fine brush, and while that dried I gave the cockpit floor and sidewall details a coat of Tamiya black panel liner to highlight their details and add a bit of a grimy look. After the panel liner dried, I then used a cotton bud with some X20 enamel thinners to wipe some of the excess panel liner away and make it a little bit lighter. Once everything was dried, I then gave the cockpit floor a dry brush with some Tamiya dirt and sand weathering pigments to add a bit of a dirty effect to the cockpit floor, and then I cut out the exhausts and glued them to the inside of the fuselage halves. The gun sight was glued into place on the instrument panel and then painted a coat of German grey, followed by flat earth for the leather padding and Vallejo silver for the actual sight. The instructions show decals being included for seat belts, but unfortunately none of the decal sheets seem to have them. So I decided to improvise by attaching 1mm thick masking tape to the seats and then painting them Vallejo buff along with a dab of Vallejo natural steel to add some metal buckles and details to them. With the cockpit finally done, I glued the floor to the right half of the fuselage and then I glued the two fuselage halves together. The fit on them was pretty decent, although the cockpit did seem a tiny bit wide for the halves and made it a bit tricky to bond them. I then used some bulldog clips to hold the fuselage halves together while they dried, and began to sand away part of the top of the engine cowling. I glued the two machine gun barrel pieces into the cowling, although the fit for them was pretty poor. I then glued that to the fuselage, along with the radiator for the bottom of the cowling. I cut out the lower wing section and then sanded the seam lines on it down with a file and a bit of sandpaper, and then started to work on the radiators. The wing radiators have 2 parts for each side, which annoyingly have to get cut down from a square shape to more of a triangle one so that they can fit between the wing halves. After spending a bit of time cutting them and reshaping them, I then glued them into place. While the radiators dried, I then cut out the base of the prop along with the propeller and the spinner and glued those together. I cut out the pieces for the landing gear, which consisted for each side of a strut, a wheel, and a landing gear bay cover. I glued the struts to the underside of the lower wing, which unusually has the wheel well details moulded into the bottom of it, and then I glued the landing gear covers to the struts. The tyres had a bit of a seam line on them which had to be sanded down, but once that had been done, I then glued them onto the strut. Fortunately, the assembly of the landing gear was pretty easy and they're relatively solid. The upper wing halves were then cut out of the sprue, and then after being cleaned up, they were set aside. I decided to paint the interior of the wheel well and the radiator with Vallejo German grey. The upper wings also received some German grey since they had a little bit of extra moulded detail for the larger part of the wheel well. In some pictures of BF-109 G-14ASs, you can see that they have red tyres and landing gear struts. According to my research, it seems this was done sometimes in the field by ground crew on the G-14AS to signify with its new engine and an MW50 injection system that it required a higher octane fuel known as C3 synthetic fuel. It's difficult to determine from black and white photos just how common this was, but since the scheme in this kit had C3 markings for the fuel placards, and it was something more unique for the G-14AS, I decided to go ahead and paint the wheels and the struts with Vallejo Vermilion Red. The radiators were painted natural steel to give them a metallic appearance, and then I glued the upper and lower wing halves together. The wing halves fitted well, and with them bonded together, I could then glue the fuselage to the wings. I then cut out and sanded the horizontal stabilizers and the large late war wooden tail for the 109, and then glued those into place, followed by the fuel tank holder and the supercharger air intake. There were a few gaps present, so I had to use a cocktail stick to apply some Vallejo water-based putty over some of the gaps, mainly between the wings and the fuselage, the horizontal stabilizer and the fuselage, the gaps along the leading edges of the wings, and also a bit of a gap between the fuselage halves. I really liked the markings that were included on Yellow 15, which was Scheme 2 in this kit from Jagdgeschwader 300, although I also really liked the unpainted undersides of Scheme 3, which was White 13 from Jagdgeschwader 53. So in the end, I decided to combine both of these by doing unpainted metal undersides for the wings, but doing the rest of the aircraft as Yellow 15, which seemed like it could still be quite realistic. I decided the best way to go about doing this would be to paint the metal with an aerosol paint on the underside first, and then carefully paint around that by brush. I first used some tape to mask off the tyres and landing gear struts, and once the radiator flap had been painted on the inside and then glued into place, the excess putty and seam lines had been sanded away, and any lost panel detailing had been rescored onto the model, I was then ready to begin painting. I wanted to aim for a more dull aluminium finish, so I decided to go with Tamiya AS12 Bare Aluminium, which I sprayed lightly onto the underside of the aircraft in 3 coats. After giving the last coat of paint a full 24 hours to harden and cure, I then removed the masks from the undercarriage and began painting the painted regions on the fuselage with AK Interactive's RLM76 Variation 1. I thinned the paint using a little bit of water to help reduce any brush strokes and also to prevent the recessed surface details from getting lost under any thick coats of paint. The RLM76 version 1 was applied to the forward nose, as well as the underside, the horizontal stabilizers, flaps, slats, ailerons, and the landing gear doors. For the second fuselage colour, I use AK Interactive's RLM76 Late War version, which is a more yellow variant of 76. This was again thinned down using some water and then applied carefully over the middle section of the fuselage and around the tail. I tend to use AK Interactive paints for all of my Luftwaffe colours, since AK Interactive use the proper RLM codes for them, and although I'm sure there are many variations and interpretations, the ones that AK seem to produce seem pretty accurate in my opinion. They're also pretty good for brush painting, being water-based acrylics, and they seem to be of quite a nice quality. A further 4 coats of Variation 1 and 3 coats of the late war variant of RLM76 were applied over the same sections until I ended up with a nice and uniform finish for all of the colours. Thanks to applying the colours in several thin layers, I was able to get a pretty smooth brush painted finish, which I was quite happy with for these lighter colours. For the first layer of camouflage on the upper surface, I went with RLM75 and applied it over the upper surface of the body, the wings, and the horizontal stabilizers. As much as possible, I'll try to apply the paint in the direction air would flow over the aircraft, usually nose to tail, as painting in the same direction helps to reduce As much as possible, I will try to apply the paint in the same direction air would flow over the aircraft, which is usually nose to tail, as painting in the same direction helps to reduce brush strokes, although sometimes in tight spaces or when I wanted to spread the paint out a little bit quicker, like over the wing, I'll apply the paint in a different direction and then later try to spread it backwards in that other direction. A finer brush was used for the edges of the camouflage and to apply the strange pattern of branches on the rudder, which I based on the marking guide and applied freehand. A second coat of RLM 75 was applied before I then got out my fine brush once again, this time to create the dark green camouflage pattern using some of AK Interactive's RLM 82. The RLM 82 was thinned down with water, and then I applied the outline for each camouflage shape before filling it in along the wings and the upper fuselage. To create the mottling pattern on the sides of the fuselage, I first thinned down some RLM 82 with even more water than normal, and then dabbed it gently onto the sides of the model and spread it around to make the rounded shapes that I wanted. This process was then repeated with the RLM 75 for the grey modelling, though in some spots I only had to dab a few small dots on rather than try to make larger shapes. While this layer of modelling dried, I then applied a third coat of RLM 75 on the rest of the plane, helping to neaten up any of the edges around the RLM 82. The model shapes looked a little bit too thin in their centres in my opinion, so I applied a second coat of RLM 76 and 82 respectively over the centre of them. While this dried, I then applied some RLM 70 onto the spinner and prop blades, and I also used it to dab some extra modelling onto the rudder and the tail. I find that the trick to creating modelling with a brush is to then apply a thin layer of RLM 76 over the top of the modelled shapes once they have dried, making sure to use the same variation as the base colour for where the modelling is positioned. You can always add a little bit more water to make the modelling more visible, or add a little bit more paint if you want to make the effect a bit softer. On this kit, I experimented by doing several layers to soften the modelling, especially on the larger shapes, which seemed to work pretty well. In between doing layers of RLM 76 to soften the modelling, I also applied the late war circular cuts of RLM 76, which you sometimes see on the leading edges of late war 109's wings. When I applied the second layer of RLM 76 over the outside of the modelling, I tried to paint it more away from the centre to create a bit more of an airbrush and faded look to them on the edges, and I have to say I'm pretty pleased with the results, and I had quite a fun and relaxing time painting them. A fine brush was then used to apply some RLM 75 and 82 over any dodgy areas to help neaten things up, and then I got out some XF63 German Grey and painted any mistakes I'd made on the rear cockpit bulkhead that occurred during painting the camouflage, and I also used it to paint grey into the wheel wells and on the inside part of the landing gear doors. A second and third coat of RLM 70 were then applied to the props, and in between these two coats I painted the tyres flat black and used Vallejo Vermilion Red to paint several coats to make the identification band on the rear fuselage, as well as to add a few coats of red onto the wheel hub and the strut. A few details were picked out on the strut using XF16 flat aluminium, and then I used Vallejo flat white to paint the spiral on the spinner, which would have been there to help ground crew see the propeller spinning in a noisy and busy airfield environment. Although there was a decal included for the spiral, I personally find it a lot easier to just hand paint them. A few more touch-ups were done with various colours, and to neaten up any overruns around the bare metal wing, I used a cocktail stick to gently scratch off any excess RLM 76, which, since the AK paints are acrylic, would easily scratch off, although the spray paint would not, which made cleanup quite easy. A final coat of white was applied to the spiral, and after this was neatened up with some RLM 70, I then got out some Vallejo gloss varnish and applied it over the entire model to help create a protective layer to prevent paint from scratching, and also to provide a smooth glossy surface for the decals to prevent them from silvering. I gave the varnish a day to dry and then began to cut out and dip the decals I needed in some warm water, and once the decals started to come loose of the transfer paper, I then slid them onto the model and used a bit of water and a brush or my finger to help move them around. Unfortunately, the decals in this kit weren't really the best. I found that they were very fragile and prone to tearing, and the white crosses on the wings actually folded up on themselves and then tore, so I had to replace those with some spares from an Italeri kit. Although the finest stencils looked good on paper, some of these ones also were rather prone to breaking, and a few simply disintegrated in the water. Though most of the larger placards and walkway markings were fine, unfortunately I did lose some of the finer ones. After all the decals were in place, I then applied some Tamiya decal adhesive over the top of them to help them conform to the surface of the model and make them look painted on. I normally use some decal softener as well, but the decals were already pretty thin, so I didn't bother with this model. After giving the decals a day to dry, I then applied a coat of Vallejo water-based matte varnish over the entire model, except for the unpainted metal on the underside, which I carefully painted around since I decided to keep it with a bit more of a gloss finish. As for the rest of the model, the matte varnish made it look a little bit more realistic and was a more appropriate tone and finish for the colours, and it also helped to blend the decals and the camouflage together. The matte varnish was given a day to dry, and then I moved on to the weathering process, starting with creating the metal chipping. To do this, I used a fine brush to dry brush some XF16 flat aluminium where I wanted to create some paint scratches. I painted the exhausts with Tamiya X31 Titan Gold, and then once the metal chipping had dried, I used a fine brush to dab some of the base colour from around the edges of the chipping to create a more subtle effect by reducing how much paint chipping had appeared, and also to create a layered and distressed look around heavier areas such as the walkway. At this stage, I also started to paint some of the finer details on the sprue, such as the antennas, the fuel tank, tail wheel, and the control balances. I used a fine brush to paint the red tabs on the control surfaces using vermilion red, and continued to paint the tail wheel using German grey as a base for it, followed by flat black for the tyre and Tamiya XF52 for the fabric covering on top of it. Finally, the centre strut for the tail wheel and also the tip of the pitot tube were painted with flat aluminium, and then they were left to dry. I used XF63 German grey to paint the non-glass section of the armoured headrest, and to pick out the frame details on the canopy, creating the internal colour for the frames. Once this was dry, the cockpit frames were then painted their exterior colour of RLM82, which I did in several layers. While the first layer of RLM82 on the canopy dried, I cut out the control balances, antennas and the tail wheel, and glued them to the aircraft. Once the small parts had been attached to the aircraft, I then painted a second coat of RLM82 on the outside of the canopy, and then I used a cocktail stick to remove any mistakes and excess paint from the areas I wanted to keep transparent. To glue the armoured glass window into place, I squeezed out a dollop of Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue and dipped the edges of the window in it before then sliding it into the canopy, making sure to line it up with the fuselage. While the armoured glass dried, I painted the antenna on the underside XF52 flat earth, as many of the late war 109s had bare wooden antennas in this position. Unfortunately though, while I was painting the antenna, the canopy fell off the model and managed to land right in the CA glue. Fortunately though, this glue dries clear and doesn't fog up plastic, and I was actually able to scratch it off after it had dried. Definitely not ideal, but it was certainly not a ruined canopy, which was a relief. To create some post shading and help to highlight the recessed details, I applied some Tamiya black panel liner scent along all the recessed panel lines, and then dabbed it into various areas of detail on the model, especially around the control surfaces. Once dry, I then used X20 enamel thinners to rub away the excess panel liner and to help it flow more into the gaps using capillary motions. Using the water-based varnishes and acrylic paints fortunately means that you can use enamel thinners and it will only remove and soften the panel liner since it's enamel. Once I had achieved a look I was happy with, I got out my Tamiya Master weathering powders and used some rust pigments to give the exhaust a slightly more rustic appearance, and then I used some black pigments to create the exhaust streaks, and to add some black grime and streaks coming from various access hatches, the radiator and the control hinges. I streaked a little bit of the rust pigment to add some extra colour around the radiators, and removed the excess using a damp cotton bud, and then repeated the process a few times of adding streaks and blending them away until I was happy with the build-up. Some sand and mud coloured pigment was used on the walkway areas, as well as the tyres, landing gear and the landing gear bay doors, to give them a slightly dirty appearance as if the aircraft had been operating out of unpaved airstrips. The wooden antenna received some Vallejo wood grain paint to give it a little bit more texture, and to improve the canopy I used a fine brush to apply some Deluxe Materials that looks like glass over the clear sections to give it a bit more of a realistic and clean appearance. Vallejo Model Air RLM01 Silver was used to give the pitot tube a more shiny appearance, and then I used some AK Interactive's mega thin elastic rigging and some super glue to create the wiring for the antenna. This was actually the first time I'd used this product, and though it was still fiddly to do, the rubber wiring seems pretty strong and stretchy, and it responded very well to the CA glue. And although I think the small wire is at a bit of an odd angle at the back of the aircraft, I'm still pretty pleased with the results and look forward to doing some more rigging in the future. RLM01 was once again used to paint the nav lights, and after that had dried, I then applied some X27 clear red and X26 clear green over the top of the silver to give them their light colour. I had to replace the original gun sight, which unfortunately fell off during the painting process, and fortunately a slightly different one was included in the kit. This one was installed and then painted in the same way, and the last thing to do was then weather the drop tank using a mix of enamel panel liner and some more of the weathering pigments to add some grime and fuel streaks, and after the fuel tank was then attached, the AZ model BF109 G-14AS was finally completed. And here you can see the finished model. So on the whole, I'm really pleased with how this one turned out, although there are some issues with the AZ model kit, mainly in the decal department with the smaller decals breaking apart in the water, and no seatbelt or instrument decals included despite what the instructions say. Also, the option to have the canopy displayed open, given a lack of pilot figure and the really nice cockpit details, would have been nice. On the plus side though, as I mentioned, the interior moulded details are great, the kit goes together reasonably well, and it seems to quite accurately depict the BF109 G-14AS. In terms of value for money, I paid $30 AUD for this kit, which for no masks or photo etching does seem a little bit high in my opinion, but it's still pretty comparable to other 109G and F models in 1/72nd scale on the market. So compared to other 109s, I would say the closest comparison would be the Tamiya 109 in terms of level of detail. Although the Tamiya kit has cleaner moulding and is better fitting, the AZ model seems to have a few extra details for the cockpit, and it is a fair bit cheaper compared to the Tamiya 109, at least in Australia. And honestly, I have to say I enjoyed making the AZ 109 a lot more than the Tamiya one. This was probably more due to personal preferences, and I think I have improved a little bit so it felt a little bit easier, although I have to say something about the more conventional build style of the AZ kit and the better fitting canopy and less strange assemblies made it feel a little bit more comfortable to do. I feel like I've definitely managed to improve my painting compared to the last 109 I did, and I'm really pleased with the more restrained than normal approach I did to weathering this model. I'm also quite happy with the new AK interactive rigging wire I tried out. It definitely seems to take the model to the next level without adding too much effort to the build process. I definitely enjoyed building this model, and I'm looking forward to doing the other AZ model I have, which is of the F series, which I've also done an inbox review of previously. I think it's pretty great that AZ models do such a wide range of markings, both common and rarer variants of the 109, so not only are they getting a lot of mileage from their toolings, but it also gives a wider range of 109s for us to choose from, depending on what theme you want to go with. So maybe it's not the best kit if you're wanting to start out with a 109, you're probably better off going for the much simpler but a little bit overpriced Airfix 109, or perhaps even an old Italia or Academy one just to cut your teeth on. But if you have a bit more experience and are prepared to do a little bit more sanding, you can get a pretty nice kit out of the AZ model, and I would definitely recommend it. So that pretty much wraps it up for the AZ model G14. I have got the F4/R1 to start pretty soon, and also the Airfix, Mr. Craft, and an old Hella 109 to do a video on, so I'm sure I'll be doing those pretty soon, hopefully. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and if you have any suggestions for how I can improve, or any nice comments, leave it down in the comment section below. A big shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund buying these kits. If you join up, you get discounts in my Colt store, as well as slightly early access in the upper tiers to my videos, and I do hope to be doing some more exclusive content in the coming months. Thanks again for watching, and as always, take care, and until the next video, model on.